Jane, I really like to welcome you back enthusiastically, because it was such an interesting interview that we did with you, and it really opened my eyes to the inherent misogyny that it's within, embedded within the economics profession, and how that came about. But the other thing that we discussed as well was blue gold, and you had been profoundly disturbed, I could tell that, by a conference that you'd been to where people involved in the finance industry started to refer to blue gold. And it took a wee while for you to realize they were talking about water. And coincidentally, at the same time, I just read an article or a tweet by someone who was growing concerned about our water resource in Scotland as well. So it was interesting to me that those two ideas came about or clashed at the same time, certainly in my mind. And I really wanted to talk to you again about your knowledge about this and what you're seeing happening across the world. So yeah, do enlighten us, Jane. Tell us what you've learned about the pursuit of blue gold.
I feel that since we spoke, big things have changed. That was a year ago. I mean, one, you've gone into politics, which, you know, congratulations. I'm thrilled by that, because I think that's where all the change is going to happen. So I feel that my first introduction, interestingly, into this, well, my first kind of big forum that was organized to discuss this whole, what you might call financialization of nature, which leads to ideas like blue gold, actually happened in Edinburgh in 2015, the Forum for Natural Capital. So it's interesting also, just to connect it back to the series of clashes and coincidences, that Scotland is so central to this movement of representing the value of nature in economic terms, in terms of capital. So I was really, really interested in that then. Already with my own misgivings, which had fed into a lot of the way that I spoke about it in my book that came out in 2014, which was about this new way of valuing nature in terms of economics and capital. But the first kind of thing that was, you know, apart from all of George Monbiot's amazing kind of journalism, seriously contesting this way of thinking about the natural world, was a young woman who'd been advocating for First Nations and other communities in the Amazon, and actually on the front line of environmental action, especially to do with water. And she said, what happens when we start to talk about it in terms of blue gold, natural capital, even though blue gold wasn't a phrase that came up at that conference, is we change the type of people who come to the meetings. It shifts from being the actual activists and environmentalists on the front line and the scientists who genuinely know about what's going on, and it shifts it to big cities, big financial institutions, and money people, mostly men, but that doesn't really matter, in service to profit. And so that was like the first sort of twinge in this whole, you know, because part of my mind is open to the idea that maybe it's a good idea to represent the value of water and forests, standing forests, clean rivers, healthy oceans, in terms of a language that economics can understand. And yeah, the second huge thing for me was hearing those financiers, and they weren't any old financiers, they were the absolute power brokers of New York, like the serious global financial wizards. And that was in 2016. So actually, I've been in a kind of schizophrenic place, I suppose. So I've been following all those horrendous initiatives, like for me, it's particularly Coca-Cola and Pepsi in places in America where they've privatized the town's water supply. Flint, Michigan was one huge story where the actual citizens of the town had no water, had to buy it, truck it in, because the state had given most of the water resources to the two huge cola manufacturing, you know, soft drink providers. So that is a privatization of water that was having already, and this was, well, going back well into the 2010s, you know, having the most outrageously detrimental effect on the local community. So that really, so I could tell you some terrible stories about that, and they just go on and on. But I also have shifted my attention away from that because of how heartbreaking that is to where positive stories might be told. So
yeah, so the other thing that you brought up in the last program as well was the concept that the Chinese government were mapping the where was blue gold rich essentially in the world, which I found quite disturbing.
yeah, okay, so let's
Tell
just
us a
go.
little bit more about that.
Yeah, so going right back to that sort of moment of crisis in that particular meeting in May 2016 in New York, which really sort of mobilized me, and because it was, it broke my heart. It was like a crisis, an existential crisis. So that and I had a few contacts in those financial institutions that were actually heart-centered people, and was equally distressed at what they were beginning to see going on. And one of them, who was just leaving Bloomberg, spoke to me, as long as his name didn't get as long as his name was kept private. And he was the person that told me not only about I already knew instinctively about the dangers of turning a sacred good, the foundation of all life on earth, into a privatized commodity to trade in futures for a profit. Already my whole being just knew that wasn't right. And even he was verifying it. He was actually leaving Bloomberg because of what he was witnessing in terms of this kind of trajectory that the financial institutions were taking. And so he spoke to me about the fact that Bloomberg itself and Google had spent years developing these huge mapping systems of the planet, using citizen sort of iPhones in all the different places on Earth to map where the fresh water supplies were for the benefit of the huge corporations. So data that Bloomberg might then sell on, Bloomberg and Google might then sell on to corporate interests. But he also told me that an equivalent initiative was going on in China, and that there was this kind of race. So this is 2016. So who knows where this race is at now, but because that was a very different era, as I'm sure all your listeners and you are aware, to how things are now in global geopolitics. But at that stage, there was a race to map the earth to really bring to the attention of those who wanted to effectively mine water for private use, for industry, to show them where that water was. Yeah, and I found that really horrifying.
In the UK, more recently here, there has been some debate over the past 10 years or so about fracking.
Yes.
And we have a moratorium on fracking in Scotland, so you can't frack here. Our government specifically said that that's not going to happen. But I think a lot of people became aware at that time as well, also how much water was required and how polluted the water would become after it had been used to frack as well. And I think then people were starting to get a sense of, how precious water is. Conversely as well, I would say, Jane, up here in Aberdeenshire where I live, we've had the most horrendous flooding over the past, this weekend actually, where rivers have burst their banks. A woman's been lost with her dog, probably washed out to the North Sea, perhaps by now. And yeah, we're coping with too much of it coming down. Apparently, we've had the rainfall of the whole of November come down literally over the weekend. So it's our water's out of control to some extent here as well. So a different problem. It's not coming down as regularly as it did before. It's coming down in big lumps, which is a problem.
You make me shiver all over, because I'm talking from Sydney, Australia, and the east coast of Australia has this whole year we've been experiencing outrageous floods as well. I'm not sure if you've heard about them, but whole communities having once in a century's rainfall, a whole year's rainfall in a weekend or something. And it's back again, absolutely devastating communities, whole towns underwater, never been seen before. And we're a country that is much more used to drought. And, ironically, because we were going to speak earlier a few months ago, and there was a drought in eastern Scotland, or what was, it was very, very dry in southern England and eastern Scotland. So I was thinking that might be, I'll be speaking from flood-stricken Australia and you from drought-stricken Scotland. But no, I mean, this might be an interesting moment to, because I just love water, and I intellectually and sort of emotionally, I love swimming and, everything about water. I'm sure everybody does. It's something, I mean, we're composed of water. So I've also, so I have all these horrendous stories that I could tell about how water is being privatized and how it's just getting worse. And I keep trying to work with really benevolent people who are bringing together people who are speaking in the language of natural capital, but for the best interests. And at every stage, I just hear some other new horrendous concept. Most recently, blue bonds, which is, again, this futures thing is now being developed in, again, all these huge global financial institutions. So in order to kind of keep that bit of my brain happy or sane, or, I've also been investigating water itself. And there's so much fascinating science and forestry work and farming work that's been done over, 2 millennia probably, but certainly over the last century, looking at actually the mystery of water and its anomalies and its properties, which no scientist really understands. But one of the people that I've been particularly looking at is Zach Weiss, who's just started this amazing website called Water Stories, where he's going, I don't know, have you heard of this, Zach Weiss? No. So he's been going around the world. So he worked with this extraordinary Austrian farmer who in the 1950s inherited his family's unfarmable, high up in the Alps, just mostly good for timber and maybe cattle grazing in summer, block of land. And much to everyone's shock and, the sort of local townspeople's, amazement, because this was unfarmable land, he turned it into this extraordinarily productive wonderland, mostly by removing himself from the landscape and just observing what nature wanted to do and where the water wanted to fall, and allowing the plants to go. Absolutely. And he's it's that whole permaculture principle, and he does use that word for himself, although as a young boy he learned all these things just by observing nature, as he calls it, the great university of nature. But absolutely, so he did that, and he's now working across the world. And he's trained this young American, Zach Weiss, who was so inspired by this that he's tried to find more stories like this, where people are intervening in their communities or gathering together to change the way that water is used in their communities. And he said it's been impossible to find these stories, even it's hard to find them in the mainstream media, but even when you're looking for them, it's hard to find them, which is why he's got this website. And so I've been listening to him and learning from a lot of what he's talking about, and Zach and other scientists, including an Australian scientist he's been working with, a climate scientist who's now working with soils. And they're all saying that what we perceive as a climate crisis is actually a water crisis, and that all the things that we're correlating with climate change are actually fundamentally about water, and climate change is only the symptom. So this flooding and drought sort of cycle is part of this same continuum of, and you probably know this from being Scottish, it's deforestation, or, if you take the vegetation away from the soil, the earth cannot receive the water. Equally, if you take the vegetation away from the soil, you dry up the soil elsewhere. So these kind of seasons of extreme flood and extreme drought and fire, let's introduce that, California, Australia, these all are rooted in what we've done to the vegetation cover on Earth, and therefore to the water cycle. So the more I've thought about water since we spoke a year ago and said, yes, let's talk about water, the more I realize it's actually the critical issue probably on the planet. And you're nodding, Kairin.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Yeah, I guess that's an understatement, because really we can't function without it, and
Absolutely.
its presence in our lives is starting to look quite dysfunctional. It's not functioning the way that it did certainly when I was a child or a teenager. What the rainfall that comes down now in Aberdeen and in Edinburgh as well, where I lived previously, I would describe it as what I would have seen on TV as a monsoon. It comes down really hard, really fast, and flooding occurs, whereas that wasn't something that I saw as a younger person. So, it's very clear that the pattern of our rainfall has changed within my lifetime. And this was a predicted consequence of global warming. We were told that this could happen, and it has happened. So I'm not surprised by it. I did expect it. I guess probably I'm at the stage now where I think, this is why I've gotten into politics, is because I've seen a lot of, frankly, middle-aged, privileged men make really bad decisions for many years about our planet and about how to run things, and really also thinking about our countries as businesses as opposed to being countries, and really thinking about our countries also being alone within the planet and not really thinking about the whole ecosystem of our planet. And just, it's this wrong-headedness that's so short-sighted, and it's destroying us. And I think that's also why a lot more women will start to step up as well when they see that they really have to get into places of power and stop this madness that's occurring. But yeah, the other company that I'd read about years ago, I think in the 1990s, was Nestle. Nestle was colonizing water in Canada. And I remember being profoundly disturbed about that. I just thought, this is madness. But then, of course, I don't know if you're aware that the water system in England has been privatised. It hasn't been privatised in Scotland, but it has been privatised in England. So we have massive dysfunctionality there as well, where since we've left the EU, we no longer can import the chemicals that they're relying on for treating raw sewage, and we're now pumping raw sewage out into the English Channel. And the French are refusing to buy our shellfish because, for obvious reasons, I don't need to go into that. There's so much dysfunction around water in the UK. You can see it, and obviously you're seeing it as well. And the pattern of your rainfalls changing in America, in Australia. Going back to the economics of water, do you see? Have you since that time? Have you seen more aggressive colonization of water? And are you seeing communities kick back against that?
Water is such a big question everywhere, as you say, but in Australia, yes. For me, it's just been an ongoing privatization of water. That is the kind of general movement on the planet. And so I'm trying to sort of turn away from seeing that, although I can't always, because in Australia we have one of the saviors of the planet, another white man, Andrew Forrest, who has, I'm not sure if you have heard of him, but he's been at COP, or all the latest climate change global, UN meetings, because he wants to introduce hydrogen power to his vast mining project in Western Australia, where he's mined a lot of First Nations land without proper permission and all sorts of things. But one of the first things he did, and so there's this new move now to use hydrogen power, which uses water, which sort of sounds good on paper, but because it uses so much water, and it's not even that it, because apparently on balance, it's not the amount of water that it uses that's so problematic, but it's the places that it wants to get the water from that, for me, are problematic. So during COVID, the first thing he did was jump on his private jet and go to about 47 developing world, like nations that are not hugely developed, not hugely economically rich, including Papua New Guinea, just north of Australia, and bought up or, expressed interest in a lot of these pristine water sites that are probably part of this whole Bloomberg mapping project or wherever else he's got this information from. And one of them that's particularly sensitive is in Papua New Guinea, which is absolutely pristine. It's never had even a road built into it. And over about the last 15 years, various Australian electrical companies have wanted to, explore the possibilities of tapping that water and making hydroelectricity, but all of them, for environmental impact reasons, economic reasons, social reasons, have failed. So he's now throwing a whole lot of money at that project and other projects around the world to do that. So I guess this is another kind of way that
water's being
private
colonized.
Business, that it's being colonized, and even these very out of the way places, because there's so much incentive to get this water, even if it's apparently economically unviable. But yeah, in terms of kickback, I mean, this is why I'm being so taken by Zach Weiss after learning about him a few months ago, because it's really hard to get information on this stuff. So it's just not out in the mainstream news. And, I tried to write, I did write a big essay about New Guinea in various different ways, which was published in May, but it was mostly about Australia's relationship to it through the war and our colonization of New Guinea. And all the bits I had about this contemporary colonization of New Guinea and its water resources were cut out, mostly because they didn't fit in. But I just think it's very hard to get these stories out. And it's sort of quite contentious, because once the idea of economic growth comes into it, and developing nations that are economically vulnerable, especially during COVID, things get extremely messy. But yeah, in Australia, we've had examples of Indigenous communities that have had no water because their water rights have been sold to agriculture or mining. I mean, as you say, we do have some fracking here, but we have huge mining interests, and that takes so much water. It's devastating to read how many megaliters. So yeah, the Indigenous communities couldn't have, they were equally, like the citizens of Flint, Michigan, and so many other places in the world, were trucking in water because their own water had been sold off to private business. So I don't know, Kairin, I feel that it's so piecemeal, isn't it? The way that communities can fight back. I mean, just watching what's been going on in America and in South Africa and Canada. Another thing that I've found, and that's why I became interested in law, is, and the rights of nature movement, to try and get some purchase on this, because especially in American constitutional law, but everywhere else in various formal or informal ways, corporations can trump community. Sorry, that's a terrible verb to use in the post-Trump era, but corporations have the ultimate power. So we need not just policy change and practice change, but we also need legal change.
Yeah, I think you bring up the possibility of perhaps there needs to be a network, and perhaps we could start that on this program as well, to think about having a worldwide water watch, where people are watching how water is being used in the different countries that they live in, and its exploitation. Because I was listening to Thomas Farsi, who was talking on macro and cheese recently, and when a lot of our sort of industrialists and, people at the top of business, they talk about growth and they talk about the economy, and also a lot of the politicians as well. They're not really talking about improving the economy. What they're really talking about is power transfer, and owning and being in charge of water is the ultimate power. Really, no one can live without it. You can't live without food for very long, but you can't live without water for about 2 days. So it's a very serious power tool. And I think that's what we have to be really watching for, is people trying to get power over us. in a very, very serious way. And I think that's we've all got to pay attention to that. It's a worrying trend. I don't know if you're aware that in Wales some years ago, I think this is when I was a child, or before I was born, there was a whole village was flooded in order to create a reservoir for an English city close by, and it really is a very sore thing for the Welsh people, that this whole village was flooded, for the country next door to them, essentially. So yeah, so that's a smaller indigenous population being exploited, in order to serve the larger nation next door. So that's a big wound for them. And you're talking about Flint, Michigan, and I'm interested in, do you know if the community are starting to kick back against that? Have they kicked back? What kind of results are they getting? Are they starting to vote in different people who are standing up for them, or have Pepsi and Cola just completely trodden over them and they have no power anymore?
That's such an interesting question, Karen. I haven't checked in again because so if I first heard about this, I don't know, 2014 or something, and I would be checking in, every few months because I was working in that and, very much at the front line then. Nothing had changed. And I think I probably last checked into it last year when I was writing that essay, that precipitated our first initiated our first conversation, or prompted our conversation. But there have, so I'm not sure if I mentioned last time the Rights of Nature movement, but that is a global initiative now, but started in America by two environmental lawyers who were trying to really make change, especially around water, but just around the resources of local communities, parks and forests, and, to protect them against corporations. And they realized that every time they would make some kind of gain, that, the corporation would just come in and they would have the rights. So that's when they decided that they actually had to change the laws. And so they decided to make natural entities human or legal persons so that they could stand up in courts and actually fight. So did I speak about that last time?
No, I don't think so. But yes, I know that Client Earth had been working on that as a concept several years ago. I think I'd read that Client Earth were really thinking about changing.
Client Earth. Oh, that's interesting that Client Earth was, because I interviewed them, James. I did a big story for The Guardian on Client Earth when they came to Australia, I don't know, a few years ago. And they were very much working in the old model. They're amazing, but they weren't working with Rights of Nature when I spoke to them. But this Rights of Nature movement in America, which has become global, was started in about 2010, 2009. And they helped to write the Constitution of Ecuador, which changed, which made nature a legal person so it could stand in courts against corporations. They've done huge things. And so I've also written about that quite widely. But that's in making declarations like this lake is a legal person and it exists in its own right, and its own ecological health is a legal right as much as the profit motive of the local corporations. There has been some success there. I mean, it's still an incredibly uphill battle, but in terms of community intervention to actually fight big corporations in legal courts, or in courts of law, that's one movement that's got some traction. And interestingly, in Australia, it's been taken up. There's a beautiful river in the Kimberley, which is, famously beautiful land in Australia, in northern Western Australia. And the local First Nations custodians have drawn on that Rights of Nature, sort of Western legal paradigm, and sort of translated it into their terms with the river as their ancestor, who is the legal person, and they speak for their river. So that's sort of a change which is happening here. And so I don't know if that's taken hold in Scotland, but
so I don't think we're at the stage where we need to do that yet, but
No.
part of the reason as well I wanted to interview you about this is because I guess I see it as perhaps a looming threat. And I think that you're mentioning it in the programme just under a year ago was a bit of a wake-up call for me, and I thought this is really something that I need to look at. Now, you've just had an election in Australia as well, and we've been, me and William, I think, and several other people have been enjoying the juice media take on your politicians. They're very, very funny and I think very effective as a campaigning entity. So how is it going with your new government in Australia? Are you feeling hopeful? Are they making positive changes?
So much more hopeful. So much more hopeful. Oh, I mean, yeah, so that happened in May, and I just watching the new Prime Minister and listening to his acceptance speech with, because for me, hugely important in Australia is the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the First Nations voice in Parliament and all that kind of stuff, because that's so much about, there's so much environmental wisdom and knowledge in this 60,000-year-old culture. So to honour it in that way and just acknowledge it in the first sentence of our new Prime Minister's acceptance speech, as the Prime Minister was just like, I absolutely cannot believe this. I don't even want to mention the former Prime Minister, but that was never going to come out of his mouth. So that just seemed, and I've been at a writers' festival recently talking with an amazing First Nations man, a Torres Strait Islander man, and just the energy in the room, the hope, and because it feels like we're now in a I don't even want to say the 21st century, but it feels like we're in a new era where all the things that regular Australians really, really care about are suddenly not only on the table, but actually in the mouths of not only our politicians, but our actual Prime Minister. So yeah, it feels really, really hopeful. But Kairin, just to quickly, just add one thing if we're about to wrap. This, I love what you mentioned about community water watch people, and that very much correlates with all the initiatives that Zach Weiss is driving, which relate to community water councils. He wants a whole planet where each community takes stewardship of their water and has a water like a community-run water council. So, I think your sense that water is the most important issue on Earth, most important thing, most important question, and your idea that this is what we have to all be thinking about and talking about is absolutely 100% spot on. I'm fully with you.
Yeah, I almost feel a little bit guilty laughing because it's such a serious subject. It really is such a serious subject, and I think that we interviewed a really great guest as well called Ben Franta, and he had been watching what was happening with the oil industry, oil and gas industry, and there has been so many flags for the damage that this was all going to cause, and then also with water as well. And as I said, I think I was reading about this when I lived in London. That was in the 90s. Just these stories coming out, and it was the Guardian I would have been reading as well. We've got to pay attention, because suddenly you might find you don't have something. You don't have clean air. You don't have water. You don't have food. And it's because maybe you just haven't been paying attention, or enough of you haven't been paying attention. And I hope that this programme will do something to get people to pay a little bit more attention to what is happening with our water, how are we looking after it, and are we watching that people are not trying to control us with their ownership of water or our water supply. So that's really important. Jane, thank you so much for coming on the programme again, and I'm sure we'll get you back for something else. If you want to talk about a different subject, then please let me know, and then we'll get you back on again.
Thanks so much, Kairin. It was so nice to talk to you again, and all power to you with your water work in Scotland.
Thanks, Jane. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.